Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone at SDHistCon's Winter Quarters virtual convention. I'd like to welcome today to our discussion on virtual wargaming. I'm joined here by an esteemed panel, Annette Prieto, Nick Wernert, and Andrew Olson, who are going to be sharing their expertise with us today. And this, I hope, will be a discussion that will be available for people who know both very little about professional wargaming and for people that have experience in the field. Hopefully there'll be something here for you as well. As we start out, I would like to thank SDHistCon for all their work behind the scenes in putting this convention together. Thank the panel members for joining, the audience here for being part of this, and then Sebastian Bay for all his work in putting together and organizing this. The format for today, I'm going to allow our guests to introduce themselves, and then we're going to be going through some prepared questions that we have. But if you have questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to drop them into the chat. And to the degree that we're able to, we'll try to field those questions as well. Should be about 45 minutes of discussions, maybe some open questions at the end. And we should wrap up about 5 minutes before the hour, so you'll have time to take a break before heading off to your next section. Annette, Nick, Andrew, welcome to our discussion. And I think I'd like to start out with Annette, if you would be willing to kind of introduce yourself and share a little bit about your work.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Annette. My background is in actually biodefense. I work at the RAND Corporation. I'm a technical analyst there, which means I tend to do a lot of things, and that includes gaming. I've done gaming for a few years now on various different topics and for various different sponsors. But typically strategic games is what I focus on.
And when you say strategic games, could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, so strategic games, they tend to require players to look more at managing resources, plan operations, and strategic decisions over extended periods of times. So it involves large-scale scenarios where players must consider long-term implications of their actions. Where a tactical game may look specifically at a battle, a strategic game may be looking at one side's overall approach in a conflict.
Fantastic. Okay, that's similar to what it is in hobby gaming as well. Yes, too. Yeah. Andrew, could we go to you next? Could we get an introduction?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Andrew Olson. I'm a wargaming analyst over at the Center for Naval Analysis, which is another kind of FFRDC or federally funded research and development center. Supports mostly the Navy and the Marine Corps amongst kind of other folks. Been there for about 2.5 years. The games we do are mostly analyticals in terms to educational recs. We're trying to find data. We're trying to help folks solve and structure a problem. On the team, I've done a variety of games. My current portfolio looks a little bit at kind of civilian harm mitigation. How do you protect and understand the civilian environment you're operating in and mitigate those consequences, as well as trying to help the team think a bit about kind of emerging AI applications as it informs our war game. Outside of work, I've also had the privilege to lecture at Georgetown University on kind of war game design, mostly historical war game design. A quick shout out to Nick, who will introduce himself in a second, for helping out with some of my students and mentoring their gaming project. And so very excited to be here and talk a little bit about both of those experiences.
Great, fantastic, thank you. Nick.
Hey y'all, I'm Nick Werner. I'm a gaming and planning specialist at the U.S. Department of State in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. So our bureau, we have a mandate to anticipate, prevent, and respond to conflict, and we use gaming and red teaming to help support that, not only within our bureau, but also across the State Department and the U.S. Interagency. So the type of gaming we do there, it's quite diverse, but some of the kind of major lines of effort recently have been on stuff like strategic competition, economic coercion, and also leadership transition in certain contexts. But we've gotten to work across a variety of different areas and topics.
And you mentioned a word in there I wasn't familiar with. You said red team. Is that? Could
you
explain a little bit?
So red teaming is a variety of different contrarian or analytical techniques that can be used to challenge assumptions, encourage divergent thinking around a particular issue set. There's also the kind of DoD red team sense, which is having a cell of people who are tasked with understanding the capabilities and intentions of a particular potential adversary, like a PRC or a Russia red team, and they plug into a variety of different planning processes, but we use it a little bit differently.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. Let's shift in a little bit to, I'm curious about what a typical day looks like for you in terms of you wake up in the morning. Is it different every day? Is there a lot of travel? What's your day-to-day like in terms of how that connects to professional wargaming as well? And I'll offer up whoever would like to go first.
I'll go first. I'm probably on the boring side. It includes a lot of reading for me, a lot of Googling, research for gaming, especially I think professional gaming. There's a lot of details that have to just be known, that you have to know in order to design the games. And usually the players are subject matter experts. And so you want to make sure that the details that you have in the game are right. And it's not going to detract from the game because you don't have the right asset, or, you didn't include this one information that they consider very crucial. And so there's a lot of getting smart on your part, which will help you design the game. But a lot of getting smart on also things that you want to include in the game. So lots of reading.
And will you get a certain, oh, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
I would absolutely second what Annette said. I spend a lot of my day reading as well, reading cables and stuff relevant to the issue that we're working on, and then also consulting with sponsors. Spend a lot of time doing that to make sure that what we have is fit for purpose, it answers their needs, and then also that we haven't done anything that completely is outside the bounds of the research question and what they really want us to get done. So,
Andrew, anything you'd like to add to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump on the kind of iterative meetings end up being a large portion. We talk about, particularly for analytic games, a lot of what you end up doing is trying to help the sponsor structure the problem for themselves, right? Games are a model. And so part of why you would do a game is to try to build out a model of understanding of the key factors and kind of limitations. Often folks don't know exactly what they want, or they come to us with I have this really big problem and I want this one game to solve kind of my resource constraints and, my bureaucratic challenges, my personnel challenges, and, kind of adversary technology. And you're like, okay, can't do all of that. So like, what about this? How do we structure this down? So spend a lot of time on Zoom calls, spend a lot of time on GVS. Getting that done. Also, CNA's got a number of games running concurrently often, so we end up spending a lot of time trying to help folks refine their games. So we have kind of what is a red teaming approach, as Nick mentioned, for our own games, where we sit down and they present, hey, we're doing the outcomes and objective stage, or we've done kind of a design. Let's talk through the design. Let's talk through, are we going in the right direction? And then occasionally get to sit in some kind of more fun stuff where my colleagues and their analysis, similar to RAND, but we do a lot of work kind of outside of just wargaming. So sitting in on folks talking about character deployments or developments in drone warfare, et cetera, but mostly meetings.
Okay. And we've hinted at something that I'd like to kind of to lean into a little bit more in terms of what is the typical timeline for a game project, if that might be the way to categorize it? Like, does it start with someone coming to you with a problem they'd like you to build a simulation or a game for? Or and how does it go from this beginning stage to you're playing a game with people and then perhaps debriefing or analyzing what happened afterwards?
I think that really depends, and I'm sure Andrew and Annette will jump in on this, but on what type of game that you're looking for, and then also a few key considerations, where they want it to happen, who they want involved, and then how many kind of key questions do you want it to kind of address with its central thrust. So for us at the State Department, we generally take, maybe about 2 months for ours. We have to kind of move a little fast because there's kind of policy relevance. It's a little bit more short-term issues that we are trying to respond to rather than kind of long-term, over-the-horizon strategic thinking. So generally, people will want us to move a little bit faster. And then we spend, maybe 2 to 3 weeks with them consulting, trying to get them to a concept and a question that really makes sense. And then once we have that question, it actually can move quite quickly on our end. But also,
so there's a sense of there's an urgency and a pace to this. Then I think if you're going from demand to a 2-month project and timeline, that seems like a pretty quick pace.
It is ambitious, but that's at least for ours.
Right. Annette, Andrew, how about?
I would say we're a little bit different at Rand. We have the luxury of time, it sounds like, compared to Nick there. For the most part, our projects are on a yearly basis, and so we try to do. If the project requires multiple games, then we'll spread it out throughout the year. But if there's only one, then we're probably looking at the later half of that year with to give us enough time to do analysis on the back end. But for example, one project I did now, I think from start date to actual game execution, it was probably 6 months, and that was probably on the quicker end for me. So 2 months would give me a heart attack, I think. But definitely can be done, I'm sure. But I think the most challenging part is something that Nick said there, which is scoping. Scoping is so difficult, especially when a client comes to you and says, "I want a game on this topic, but I'm not sure what yet." And the problem is usually sometimes they want to try to use the game to answer everything, and it can't do that. So you have to narrow it down and sort of refine it, and that can be the challenging part. So maybe it is good to have a short timeline, so you can say we have 2 weeks to figure this out, and that's it.
I wouldn't say better, just different.
Right. It almost sounds like, in many ways, a design thinking type of environment where you're kind of helping clients understand what they actually want and then iterating fast with prototypes and getting them finally to a situation. Andrew, it's pretty much the same thing for you, or?
So similar process to what Annette mentioned, right? Minimum kind of 6 months is what we push for. They can go up, kind of go up to a year if we've got the luxury of time. Sometimes they get pushed a little bit closer. Your question kind of was about how do we get started, and right, we talked about the iterative process kind of at the beginning, and even before that, work comes in a variety of ways for us. Some of these are kind of like a project broadly that needs a game to produce data or convene folks in an interesting way, where it's like, hey, what we really need is to get sometimes people hold a game not just because they need to play around or kind of explore a decision space, but we really need experts in a room kind of responding to a problem as a way to kind of baseline, check our assumptions, make sure we've got that. And it's people show up for a game in the way they may not answer my phone call in other circumstances. And so, sometimes we hold a game as part of a larger study or line of effort, right? And then, spend hopefully 2 months, sometimes longer, right? Trying to do the scoping and the, kind of original analysis. We'll spend, that kind of 4 months building out the game. We'll execute the game. And then usually another kind of 3 months of analysis. We'll turn around like a quick look, kind of, hey, here's some initial thoughts. And then the analysis team will do more work to kind of build it out into a report. Some folks just come for a game, right? They've got a problem they know is gameable, or there's an existing wargame series they want us to support or refine. I'd say that my impression, I've only been here for 2.5 years, my impression is people coming for a wargame itself has gone up a little bit more recently, as kind of there's the continuing hype about it. But it comes in through a variety of ways. And as folks said, often the thing that prevents us from designing is getting the sponsor to something that's designable beforehand. So whether or not it's design thinking depends. We do design thinking projects. Also, doing a prototype and then having them say that's not the rock I want burns a lot of cash. So we try to avoid as much as possible I've designed you a thing, it's not the thing you want, because regrettably we're expensive, and I don't want to spend all your money on a game you're not actually going to play. So.
And are these, just a kind of related question, are many of these games kind of one-offs where you will do this project for an extended period of time, and then once it's done, is it repurposed in other formats, or do you cycle back to previous constructions, or is it pretty much one game, one problem, and we're done?
Sure. I'll briefly answer, and then I think everyone's gonna have a different perspective based on their kind of client set. I would say almost all of our games are one-offs because they're usually trying to solve an analytic problem. I think probably 20%, or more so nowadays, we've got a couple of games that are kind of iterative series to kind of refine different parts of a problem, right? You've got a very big problem. So this one's going to bite off this chunk, this one's going to bite off next chunk, etc. When you've got a relationship with a command or an ally or a partner that works a little bit better. And we've got a couple of games that are like boxed that we'll do, but historically at least, CNA has been like, we do custom games, so your problem, your game, going forward. That's not to mean that's necessarily the best way or even the most cost efficient in all the ways. I'm sure my colleagues talk a little bit about the approaches of kind of more standard models.
Yeah, I think our approach generally maps onto what Andrew just outlined, it's generally bespoke games for a particular client set in question. And if we're trying to answer a particular research question, we can't just take a one-size-fits-all approach to that. That said, there are cases where there are maybe repeatable games or large end games, particularly in the education space, if we're designing something that we want to teach something with. And then also if you want to kind of treat large scale or large iterative games as almost a social science experiment. There's places like Sandia National Laboratory that do games like that, where they'll have hundreds of groups run through their game, and then they'll use that to generate that, rather than, and that'll be about, behavioral, sociological, like science of how people respond to a particular challenge. But that's not something we do a lot at State Department.
Annette, some offering thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. For the most part, one-off games, because they are so tailored to that question and client. However, I think sort of as was mentioned, the educational games, they're a little bit easier for clients to take themselves and say, we're going to incorporate this, or we'll play this on our end. And, we can give that game to them and all the materials we used, and, facilitator guides so that they know how to facilitate themselves. And we essentially teach them also how to run the game so that they can run it on their own. But that tends to be a little bit more unique.
Okay. And we've talked a little bit.
Sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Both folks mentioned the educational, right? There's the war college, et cetera, will often use kind of standard games for teaching students iteratively. I'd say as we've had clients who are more like hobby gamers themselves and are kind of already more comfortable with that, they'll be more interested in kind of having, like, we've got a game that's kind of a policy fishing game that's kind of like boxed up, and we've modified that for various folks. So it depends a little bit on their confidence, right? Do they want something that they can take and play with their folks on their end, right? That this is, are we designing either a socialization tool, or if it's kind of an in-the-box exercise, right? They're design thinking, or like, hey, we're constantly struggling with this challenge. Every team has this challenge. Let's think about structuring it. And so there's a game for that. Some of the think tanks do more kind of iterative games. Not as qualified to talk kind of about the approaches of that. But because we're doing research, it ends up always being, and there are models, right? Like for like matrix games, right? Might be familiar to you as an approach that a lot of folks will use. That's not in the box, but the kind of rules or structure of that are pretty standard. And so we'll borrow from some of those techniques sometimes, even if the game itself is unique.
And we've talked a little bit in generalities about kind of the work you do, but let's go into a little bit of a different question. What is a recent game that you can share with us in terms of design or challenges and things that you learned as well too? Offer it up to whoever would like to jump in. Yeah.
So I can start. So a recent game I would say that I can talk about is a game for the Coast Guard. So I actually am currently doing a lot of gaming for the Coast Guard, and I absolutely love it because I think they're starting to really understand how gaming can be used as a tool to help them answer some difficult questions. And so that's sort of exciting for me to, help them with that. So we recently done a game for them, which they have incorporated actually into their curriculum. So this is an example of one where, they've taken ownership of, but it's called Paratus Futurum, Ready for the Future. It's a strategic foresight game. So we're basically, it was basically designed to help the players make distinct mission priorities and investment choices while they're in an uncertain future. So they're dealing with different types of technological advancements, U.S. economy, either good or bad, great power competition, and even, climate weather problems. And so here, there's 4 different teams. Each team has a different world that they're in based on those factors. And basically what we're trying to help them do is see, no matter what world they're in, if there's a risk that in each world, then that means that is probably going to be a risk no matter what the future holds. And if there's an opportunity in every world that they see, then that means that might be an opportunity no matter what the future holds. And so overall, it's to help them sort of recognize what risk and opportunities might exist in whatever future they might think have. But for me, it was very interesting to see what trade-offs they make when it came to mission priorities and investment choices. And so, there's never any money, there's never enough money around, and there's never enough people around. So what choices are you going to make? So that's a recent one that I've done, and very interesting in my.
And imagine you're building in kind of ambiguity models into that as well, like uncertain future in
Yes.
those elements there, and helping people make decisions without perfect information. Is that part of that too, or?
Yes. So we have them build a strategy in the beginning, and we tell them this is a strategy, strategy should be lasting, around 15, 20 years. The injects of the game are every 4 years. And so all these things keep happening at every 4 years, but they have a strategy that they wrote in the beginning. Are they going to stick to their strategy, or are they going to deviate from that strategy? And the injects always introduce uncertainty. And so they have that decision, space where they have to decide, okay, something's happening into Antarctica, but my strategy said that I was going to focus domestically. Should I, invest resources to, to buy icebreakers so I can, if the president tells me I need to do something down in Antarctica, I'm prepared? Or do I invest in, my buoy tender so I can better, support ports here domestically? And that's a choice they have to make. And there's consequences because, maybe in the next turn, the president did want them to go to Antarctica and they're not prepared. And now, Congress is upset. They have even a smaller budget and, blah, blah, blah. The people are not happy.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I just one little aside before we move on to Andrew and Nick. You did mention there's a game that you can share with us. So you have ones that you cannot share.
Yes, unfortunately,
yeah, okay.
I tend to do a lot of games on CBRN topics, just with my background. So a lot of nuclear, biological, just weapons of mass destruction, and that always gets labeled,
Yep, confident. Yeah. Yep, I gotcha. Nick or Andrew, anyone a game particularly you'd like to share? I do have one question.
Unfortunately, most of our games are classified, and we can't talk about it in details, but there is kind of a sanitized version I could maybe share with you. So
Okay,
recently we did one with one of our diplomatic postings, and they were concerned about a irregular transition or a non-constitutional transition in that country. And we partnered up with them and we ran an exercise, a game for them, in which we kind of explored not only what their policy options were, and we also presented with some particular challenges about their embassy posture, but also how far, the main question was, how far do we go towards achieving those key objectives in the case of this emergency, this non-constitutional transition, and how do we balance that with risks of maybe offending a new government, risking our diplomatic standing there, which is very much in jeopardy in such a case. So that's the types of questions we've done, and we've had obviously the Post and the desk and a number of different experts on that country plug in on that, and everyone kind of played one big team, but we had people play their own real life roles in addressing this. It was not quite something like a crisis management exercise. It was a little bit between that and strategic exercise and game. So
fantastic. Andrew?
Sure. I think the two ones I had on tap, one was a similar kind of foresight exercise that Annette talked about. So I'll shift to kind of more of an educational kind of policy workshop one. We developed originally partially through a grant from the Pew Charitable Trust to try to help folks understand kind of IUU fishing, or illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing. So everything from kind of overfishing, being in areas you're not supposed to, exploitative labor practices, smuggling, kind of all the things that happen kind of in coastal waters and kind of the maritime environment. The goal, right, was to have everyone empathize with the different actors, right, from your local kind of small scale fisher, right, you're mostly kind of local protein production, to your kind of the national commercial kind of big trawler, or you're an overseas kind of over the horizon kind of fishing fleet that's come in, an international fleet. And how do these folks interact, right? What are their incentives? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we structure the profit motive and the different kind of political incentive these actors have, and have folks play through a couple of rounds of this game. And inevitably, right, it's a common goods dilemma. So some areas get overfished, some folks are, made some bad rolls and now in a more challenging position and begin to kind of look at, maybe underpaying folks or not maintaining equipment and causing environmental destruction. And then after it spirals for a little bit, we all come back together and say, what, given our kind of Grand Verde as our fake nation, given Grand Verde's challenges, right, what are the policy options we have? And it's meant to be played with, I know folks are interested in kind of getting into the policy space or are in the policy space already. And so they'll say, well, what if we had better VBS? Or what if we could like do better boarding and enforcement actions for the Coast Guard? Or what if we created like a maritime exclusion zone that you can't fish in during certain periods of the year? And we have some of these pre-populated. We make some of them up as we facilitate through. But basically, they get to try to play out a different set of policies and say, okay, what are the second and third order consequences? Yes, we gave a subsidy to the local fisher, but now they're just, like taking even higher risks, or we've given folks bigger boats, but that, to meet the kind of the local protein demand and make sure that everyone's not economically failing, but now there's even less fish, and now we have even more pressure on the system. And so to think through what combinations of policies would fix the challenges that we see in the game as a way to kindly lead people into a wider discussion about fishing. It's much easier to have this empathetic experience one of the people, play through the thing, than to say, hey, here's what my nation is struggling with, right? We've got smuggling, we've got corruption, yada, yada, yada. It gives you a nice proxy to be like, in Grand Verde, these were the challenges that, folks were saying. That was a lot of fun to design. It was more of a kind of classic board game system, mechanics, numbers, kind of crunchy stuff. And everyone enjoys kind of moving the pretty fish around the board. So I really enjoyed working on that one.
This kind of leads me to a question that someone has asked. I'm going to show this up on the screen here too. For your information, most of these games are closer to tabletop exercises than counters on a map. Putting this out there because this threw from your loop when I first started learning about this. Is that a characterization, or is it a little combination, or both? Or how would you respond to that comment from Tim?
I think that is fair. However, at least on our end, we do draw a distinction between a tabletop exercise and a game insofar as particularly how players' actions feed back into the scenario. So in a game, we would have simulated environment, people take decisions, but then they continue to have the consequences of the decisions play back into the kind of game state, and people will then continue to react to those in subsequent rounds or turns or however you divide it. Whereas in a tabletop exercise, it might just be, here's the problem, respond to it, and then we'll talk about it, instead of having kind of a continuous evolving game state. So,
Gotcha.
Some of our games straddle the line a little bit, but a lot of them are, we do tabletop exercises as well, not just games.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Annette.
No,
Yeah.
I would agree with that. Usually in my head, the way I balance it is depending on how much adjudication happens, then it's closer in my head to gaming, because it goes back into that feedback. But I think it also depends on what the sponsor wants. They may say game, but then they really want that discussion. And I think going back to what Andrew said in the beginning, maybe they just want people in a room to talk about a problem. And yes, that does lead back into it being a little bit more of a tabletop exercise versus maybe a true game, as maybe someone's thinking. But yes, sometimes you think you're going to start off in a game, but then when you see what the client wants, it ends up leaning more towards tabletop.
Okay.
Sorry,
go ahead,
golden
Andrew.
apple, right, of like throwing into the center, let everyone fight for any kind of wargaming shop is like, what is a wargame, right? You'll read all kinds of articles arguing back and forth of what defines a game. For the class, I told the students a wargame is a decision-making exercise in the context of a scenario with consequences. That encompasses a lot of things, right? It encompasses both the counters on a map, right? We're moving, actual things with specific rules about how far you can go, within the game system, not just adjudicated, to everything from, hey, I'm going to talk about what I would do in this circumstance, and then we're going to blend that into the story and have that affect kind of our collective narrative. And so the games, right, often there's something on the table just because it focuses the folks on what they need to talk about, whether that's an abstraction of the forces or the challenge they're trying to do, or a more traditional kind of hobby game rules of, we've depicted this new drone system as having 2 hexes of movement, a combat value of Y, and requires resupply cubes from this bit. It just depends on what the exercise needs and what the sponsor is looking to get out of it. So we end up doing both. But if you ever want to see some folks fight at a cocktail party, just throw that one in there.
Great, thank you. Kind of somewhat of a related question too, but I'm kind of curious, to what degree and in what ways do you blend technology in with the professional wargaming experiences you design? Are these high tech or intentionally low tech or something else?
So
low tech, mostly for a couple of reasons. One is classification, right? Getting stuff on kind of between networks can always be a challenge. And if you're in, a classified space, you often can't bring Bluetooth or other kind of outside electronics. So as much as I'd love to have kind of a VR, headset for every person, getting all of that approved is a challenge. Flexibility, also analog tends to be more useful, right? Like we're often doing things on the fly, much easier to create a piece or a cube or, a worksheet on kind of paper. Otherwise, that doesn't mean there isn't technology in there, but almost always analog. There is increasing interest in kind of more virtual solutions, whether that's things like modeling and sim in the room with folks or otherwise. The money, time, flexibility, and the real just challenge to get things between systems end up really limiting what we can do with the kind of glitz and the glam.
Yeah, I would add on to that there's also the element of getting players to use whatever tech that you have. And, it's not all just for young spring chickens who are very comfortable with tech. It's sometimes for senior decision makers who, have trouble opening a PDF. So, getting them to do, something very advanced, with like a headset, kind of integrate seamlessly with that can also be a barrier to using tech as well. But also, what those other elements that Andrew identified, particularly about classification, are really quite salient.
And timeline as well. Sometimes you just don't. I know for one project we wanted to include some modeling and simulation, and with the short timeline, there was just no way we could incorporate that realistically at the level that we wanted to. So, timeline doesn't help.
Right. The other challenge that comes up with this is games, you want folks to understand the assumptions we're making, right? So that we can talk about where they're wrong or right. And one of the challenges, if you have a more complex or kind of shiny Rube Goldberg machine that's kind of churning out the results, players can either feel lost, or it can be hard to kind of reconstruct why did you make this decision? When did you understand what was going on? Why did that happen? So making sure that your game is always quote unquote readable to the players is another kind of challenge with bringing in more virtual systems.
That's because I guess I had assumed it would be otherwise, but I can hear all of the reasons you're mentioning now. It makes total sense why it would want to be exactly the way you're building it. I'm kind of spinning off on a little bit of a related question, but in terms of so historically, professional wargaming has had proponents and detractors within the military. And I'm curious, is that still the case today? And does that influence your work and create challenges for you? Or is it pretty much the space that you're in, it's accepted and people really want you to come in and to do this work?
I can start. So overall, speaking from the state side, people are not really aware oftentimes of these tools. But one trend that we have noticed is that State Department particularly sends a lot of folks over to National Defense University, where they use wargaming in their courses a matter of pretty much every single course that they do. And then they come back and they're like, wow, those games were really helpful. We should do more of that here. And then they go back to their desk and they're sucked into the a million different things that they have to do on a day-to-day basis, and they can't look up from the road, so to speak. So developing a strategic culture is seen as valuable, but it's oftentimes really hard to implement. So I think that we get buy-in from people, but it's oftentimes very difficult to get their time and attention for long enough to, get tons of buy-in. So.
Yeah, I would say it depends. I think within DoD, there's the idea that this is something DoD does. Outside of DoD, though, there's a lot of, well, that's what DoD does. Like, we don't do that. So I I think it's harder to convince other agencies and other folks that this is a valuable tool and this is not just, a war game. And I think the labeling of it as war game is maybe what hinders other people to see it as a valuable tool for themselves. And so I think more and more we're trying to use just gaming in general instead of wargaming. So, we're trying to make it more open for others to be able to use it as a tool.
Yeah. It spans a range. Those folks, like Nick said, right, who are very unfamiliar or, kind of saw one version and now kind of want another kind of dose at the pie. I say there are other folks who maybe are believe it can do things that it can't, and that's often a challenge as well. Either that they were sold a bill of goods somewhere, and then they come to us and we're like, well, we can't really do that, and so one of the challenges in any kind of designer that we've all mentioned, right, is kind of walking the sponsor to a right-sized kind of understanding of what the product is doing for them, how fast and how much we can actually get done with this. You'll hear folks like, oh, the war game predicted this. Like, okay, no, so like war games don't predict. Like, let's talk about what this tells you about the future. Let's talk about, the contingency on different factors. And so both building more wide understanding in the U.S. government about like what games are good for. We talk about like almost making good sponsors. How do we teach offices and the government to have the appropriate, come to us with things that we can do, and then play well when we ask them to be our participants. And that's a perennial challenge that a lot of smart folks are thinking about, but I don't think we've quite solved.
Yeah, I think to build on Andrew said, there was this article from after the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine from a Ukrainian general who was like, the war games are useless. They didn't predict any of this, which, that's one of the big misconceptions that we run into. It's none of this is meant to be predictive. It shows you a future, not the future. So, it allows you to draw insights and potential, refine your thinking about the future, but it doesn't tell you that. I don't know if anybody's really gotten a grasp on figuring out the future.
Yeah, and what assumptions did you build into it, right? What players in the room, all of these. And so it's a very squishy tool. It's a very powerful tool. It's a very fun tool. It's a very interesting tool. But I feel like it's a little bit of like someone's like, economists are terrible because on one hand, I'm on the other hand, right? And you want a one-handed economist. I feel like some way we get the same way with designers where it's like, what did this tell me? It's like, well, based on the people in the room today, based on the assumptions we built into the model, based on the gameplay and decisions you made, here is like some interesting things you can learn. And like, can you be more specific than that? And it's like, nope, I would be incorrect in my duty to give you more, than what you can, right? You can build out analysis and yada, yada, yada. But I feel like I get a lot of folks looking at us like, come on, like.
We've hinted at some of the challenges in your job. Are those the biggest challenges now that we've talked about? Are there others that, like, if you had to say, this is my greatest challenge in my job, how might you think about answering that question?
I definitely think the lessons learned is a challenge. You don't want someone to walk away with the wrong lessons. And maybe we don't know what the right lessons are, but you definitely don't want them to walk away with the wrong lessons of, oh, I have the answer. I need to buy more tanks. That you don't want them to walk away from the table with those assumptions. And so I do think after action reports usually will help avoid that, but those can take a while to write. So then there's a few days there where people, have those assumptions, and it's not even guaranteed that the players will read our after action report. So, I think that's always a risk. And definitely a challenge. And the scoping, I'll always say scoping is a challenge for me. So those are my main two.
I think I would agree that it's the part that comes after that's by far the hardest part, making sure that people actually follow up on recommendations, is seeing if there is measurable policy contribution or learning outcomes. That's something that I think is probably a little bit harder. And I don't think any wargaming shop really has it totally down pat. Like, we try and do interviews, 3-6 months after our games to, say, okay, you were in this. Were there direct policy outcomes? There were these recommendations from the report and the after action. What happened to those? And to a degree that is useful, but at the same time, you can only really ever do contribution, not attribution, to a particular policy outcome or some sort of learning outcome. It's very hard to disaggregate where does the war game fit in with all the other discussions that you have that took place around this.
I would say a similar thing in a different way. One that we haven't hit on is people management is a challenge in games, right? Where you're MC and analyst and like facilitator and professor and all these things at the same time when you're running a game, right? You're trying to manage personalities and energy and keep folks on topic, and everyone's got to often come in with a topic that's really close to their heart, which may or may not be relevant to the game at that moment, or they really want to make sure that their opinion is heard or their equities are represented, and how to make sure that folks are heard and get to express these things without fully derailing my game and just being the loudest voice in the room, getting to kind of make the decisions. And so people management is a challenge, doing that gracefully, doing that in a way that continues to collect evidence. And then what Nick said at the end, right? We spend a lot of time really getting familiar with problems, which is a broad challenge for DoD analysts or kind of folks working in government, is you'll spend a lot of time building out a model, understanding the problem, spend a whole year understanding exactly how bad, what all the pitfalls are and the terrible incentives, et cetera. And then you do the game and you write the report, and there may be no effect, right? Because of bureaucratic incentives or just because of life events or anything else. And so it can be challenging to get really familiar with the problem, and know it kind of in depth, and then have not a lot of power to ultimately affect the outcome of that challenge.
Something I'll tell you, since you mentioned people management, another tricky thing is when you get players that try to game the game. Because it's a game, people think I got to win. And so making sure that, that's not a player's intent, that they're not trying to do moves just to win instead of doing things that they would actually do, or take steps that they would actually take. So that's also something you have to deal with as you're dealing with the people.
Fantastic. Right. Thank you. What skill or experience has been the most useful to you as a professional wargamer?
I'll jump in to talk about people management. Ironically, doing improv in college has been very useful, just kind of being quick on the feet, being able to verbally spar ends up being super useful, and facilitating groups and clubs, right? So a lot of hobby gamers end up becoming war gamers, and one of the skills that carries over between, if you've ever run a board game night or ever run a D&D group, the similar kind of making sure everyone can talk, making sure everyone's respected, keeping the energy and the group on schedule, can be a really key one. And then just the general, one of the key skills we've talked about a couple of different ways is you've got to get good at getting familiar with problems and structuring problems for folks who maybe haven't had the time to think about it in the way that you're trying to do within the bit. And so, the way that, all those, I like to think that the money I spent on grad school may have been useful, right? Is all of the thinking about how to, get familiar and structure and think in models. So I'd say people management, facilitation, improv, D&D, and then the ability to just kind of structure problems that various academics provide.
And is there a sense that when you get to the moment when you're bringing the game before people, is there a nervousness there? Kind of, this is game day, this is showtime, and is there an element of kind of an adrenaline rush before you start to do these, or is it more like, nah, we get this down, I'm pretty chill about the whole thing?
Depends on the game, depends on the folks,
okay. Depends
on, is this day 1 or day 5, right? Like if it's day 5, then like I'm just trying to get there on time, and like what the caffeinated, not that I'm like jittering out of my suit, but also not asleep at the table. So it depends. It gets easier, but it's a production, right? You're putting on not a play, but you're putting on a workshop, you're putting on an event for a week, and that's a lot of energy.
For that, usually what helps is I'll do play tests before the actual game. And I have that luxury because I have time. So Nick, I'm not sure how much you can squeeze that in, but I'll do a lot of play tests, and then I'll do it with, my coworkers, and RAND folks have no problem tearing down scenarios and games. And so if it can survive, the RAND folks, I know usually it can survive whatever player I'm bringing it to. So the more playtests I do, the calmer I am on game day.
Okay.
Yeah, I would also echo that sentiment as well. But I think at the same time, like it's so to speak, your brain on a table is the game that you've put out there, and it can be difficult particularly during playtests, for people to say, well, you got that completely wrong, you idiot. Why did you do that?
Has that happened? Do you have ones that have just completely gone sideways and you're like, oh, that didn't work?
We've had one or two really bad playtests, but that's why bad playtest is a good final rehearsal.
Right.
Yeah, when you build more like mechanical systems too, like often the first play test, you put it in front of folks and they play not at all how you thought they were going to, right? Because you've thought of the system and the incentives, and then they're like, hey, the incentives don't work at all. I'm gonna, just make infinite tank spam and win the game. And you're like, but that's not like what you're supposed to be doing. It's like, well, that's how your rules read, right? Like that's what we put in front of me. So playtesting is key, both for the making sure that you don't screw up, and also being calm. But you gotta like gird your ego before you go into any of those. It's always a long day when I've got a couple of those.
Yep.
And then do you have multiple playtests then? So is it you're going through a dozen iterations before you finally bring it to the client, or is it just you get one or two and you got to go?
Maybe not a dozen. Maybe not a dozen, but I sometimes I can only do one, and I hope that that's enough. I got enough good feedback that I can make changes, and game day is good. But my sweet spot is usually like 3. So 1, that's when I realized that I didn't explain the game well enough, or like it only made sense in my head, but to no one else. 2 is, when I figure out, these are the things I forgot, and these are the questions I need the facilitators to actually ask. And, these are the rules that people need to know, and I need numbers for this and whatnot. And then 3 is okay, actually, it's not as bad as it seems. We can do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Like 2 to 3 at minimum, I think, is like what you should be aiming for these bespoke ones. Obviously, like commercial games get dozens, if not hundreds, of play tests. But at the same time, it really depends on what type of game we're putting out. If it's something that's more rigid, that has a lot of rules, and we need the players to go off and do it more or less on their own, that is something that needs a lot more playtest. Whereas something that's more seminar or a little bit more flexible, I think that's more open to fewer playtests to get something right, because that's it's got established traditions. It's very heavily reliant on facilitator knowledge and facilitator comfort. So that may not require as many.
And depends also, right, what you need the players to do, right? As Nick said, right, if we've got I need them to ingest a bunch of information and then make decisions, versus if they're coming with their expertise and they're doing something similar to what they do during their J job, right? If they're usually an intelligence officer and I'm just asking them to comment on what they would do in a certain circumstance, right? I need to think a lot about the scenario and how to present this information, and we're using time well, etc. But the actual mechanics of kind of that more open adjudication needs to spend less time polishing, and so you spend more time on the kind of event flow and materials and the slides and the scenario. Whereas if you've got a very kind of hard and chunky game, then you gotta, as we said, make sure that it doesn't go off the rails. We have a mandatory effectively 3 play tests as part of our check boxes. You can, if you get it more with your budget and your time, that's great. And plenty of meetings beforehand, right, on that scoping, which ends up being even more of a challenge than the playtest, because if they change the scoping after your playtest, then everything's out the window, and we've got a challenge.
Makes sense. We have a question from one of the audio members that we have in the audience. We have a significant number of people. Most everybody here plays historical games as a hobby. So I think this might be career related here, but what paths were taken for you to reach your current organizations? How would you recommend people finding opportunities in this field?
So I came to the field of wargaming from the background. I'm trained as an Arabist, Middle East Studies. That's why I came to DC for. I was hoping to do foreign service, but essentially trained as international relations, political science background, and had to make a pivot during a hiring freeze a few years ago. Wasn't able to get hired by the Foreign Service, so went over into wargaming. I just started playing a lot of games and meeting game designers, and that kind of led me towards the professional wargaming space, getting to know those people, helping them with some of their projects. For example, like Sebastian Bay, helped him with designing and developing Littoral Commander, Indo-Pacific, and then was able to parlay that into a job using Littoral Commander for professional military education with the Marines. And then so far that kind of landed me my job with the State Department doing essentially policy gaming, but for diplomats.
So I started off as a pre-med down in undergrad, where I thought for sure I was going to be a doctor. And after shadowing some doctors, I realized, wow, I don't like people enough to do this. So I said, okay, I'm going to do some lab work. And then I realized I didn't like diseases enough to do that. So I needed to find a balance between people and diseases, and ended up in DC. So started studying policy, got into RAND, not specific for gaming, but eventually one of my mentors at RAND said, hey, do you want to come see my basement? Very sketchy, but it was to do some historical gaming. And that's how I started sort of gaming, I think, as a hobby. And eventually I enjoyed it so much that I sought opportunities at work to do it for work. And so that's the path I followed. For recommendations, I really had no background for this. However, I just enjoyed it. And at work, I was able to find opportunity. It was easier for me at work because my work does policy research, which lends itself nicely to do gaming. So unfortunately, I would say I'm not sure what the right path is, but that's the path I took, and I'm quite satisfied.
That's a fascinating start to go from pre-med to where you are now.
Very, very different.
It's literally 180 degrees in the opposite direction. I mean, I guess there's some biological elements to the.
There are. I always try to sprinkle one biological attacks in my games.
Oh, there you go.
So.
Yeah. Andrew, how about yourself?
I ironically was also a biologist once upon a time. I graduated poli-sci biology from college, ran a research lab for a while, went to Georgetown for kind of tech policy, was looking to do kind of gene editing stuff. Ended up taking Sebastian's course and he teaches in the security studies program there. And so kind of got introduced to the field, got a chance to kind of do some work with when I was interning at the State Department to some of the folks that were kind of predecessors to where Nick works now, and got to kind of work there and got hired at CNA. As for recommendations, right, the two skills, right, you need to be a designer both are that kind of analytic problem set thinking that we've all kind of talked about in some way is in our backgrounds, particularly for analytical gaming, right? To be able to structure a problem, write research papers, etc. And the other is design. And unfortunately, the only way to kind of get design experience is to do design and to play games and to kind of get your hand in the field. That said, it's a small field, right? A lot of folks don't know about it because there's not that many folks that do it. There's the places we've mentioned before, the FFRDCs, right? RAND, CNA, IDA, John Hopkins APL, a couple other places in DC. There's the kind of the think tanks that have started to do this kind of a little bit. There's the kind of consulting firms, Deloitte or McKinsey, or Boozell and Hamilton has teams that will staff wargaming places as well as run wargames themselves. And then there's in the military, right? So there are folks who are at commands or at the war colleges or the graduate kind of graduate colleges. We mentioned NDU, Air Force, or the Air Force postgraduate school might be the right one, but there's the Air Force one. There's Army War College, Naval War College, and all those places do different stuff. So, some of those are more analytically focused, some of those more educationally focused. Those are places to look as to kind of current resources that exist. Georgetown Wargaming Society has both a Discord and kind of job postings and great kind of videos. Pack Sims is a website that often has wargaming news and sometimes wargaming opportunities as well. But most folks, I'd say, aren't hired as wargamers so much as they are hired for a skill set that would also enable them to do wargaming in some other capacity. Because a lot of shops have a wargaming division or a team that ends up drawing from outside of it. So as folks mentioned, so a hard thing to get into. There isn't yet really a set pathway. There's a lot of debate about what that would look like given the variety of skills necessary for each of those shops. So a couple of smorgasbord of information there that hopefully is helpful.
Fantastic.
Yeah, if you're interested in professional gaming, there's the Connections Conference, which is usually in the DC area every year, and that's a free conference that a lot of the practitioners, and this year I think it's going to be at Johns Hopkins APL. So, if you're interested and you're trying to break in, that'd be a great place to come and meet some people.
And for people watching, I'll try to get some links from Sebastian to put in here to some of those sources that you recommended. So if you want to follow up on some of the things mentioned here, they'll be eventually down in the video description down below. We've got about a couple minutes left. We've got through about 2/3 of our questions. This has been fascinating for me to listen to. I feel like we could go on for another hour, but I did want to end with one question that I'm very curious about. And we can do that, and then we'll wrap up shortly. But just very briefly, you design professional war games in your work capacity. Do you also play leisure board games outside of work? Or are you kind of like, no, I'm full up with games? I just don't do it. And if you do you have one game, like what's a game you really like?
So I enjoy like all sorts of games. Like my family is a puzzle gaming family originally, but I like Mahjong. I play a lot of Ricci Mahjong, but also I've got like a big board game shelf back here. So, a lot of the GMT collection. I think I saw Mark Herman in the chat earlier, like Empire of the Sun. It's a great one. So,
fantastic. Okay. Yeah. Annette?
No, I agree. Do a lot of gaming, do a lot of different gaming. I want to say with the family, it's a lot of card games.
Okay.
But historical, I think actually my favorite is Check Your Six. For some reason, I love Check Your Six. I love air combat. And I have yet to lose a Check Your Six game. So my record is still
a bold statement.
Yes.
Yeah. Challenge out there for Andrew and Nick. Yeah. Andrew, how about yourself?
Yeah, also a hobby gamer for a long time. A lot of my colleagues are as well. I wouldn't say that all professional war gamers are. I'd say a majority probably are in some way interested in hobby gaming, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite. I've been really enjoying playing the Pandemic Legacy series with my partner, who's also a war gamer. I've been really enjoying Daybreak, which is a game kind of about climate change and kind of climate policy. I've really been enjoying that with my students. I recently also got into kind of more classic miniatures gaming, so I'm doing a lot of painting, and that's been one of my stress releases with current chaos.
I just bought a paint set. I'm going to do a video on. I just painted my first mini, so I'm right there with you. But I've never done one before. So.
Yeah, well, if you ever want to, I've found it much more of a joy than I expected to. I got some free minis from a colleague of ours a while back, and the first hit was free. The rest have not been so free.
My first hit wasn't free. It's actually
I've been enjoying it quite a bit.
Yeah, I looked at some of those paint sets. I'm like, really? That's a lot of money. But we've got just a minute or so left. I wanted to thank Annette, Andrew, and Nick. Thank you so much for volunteering your time here on Saturday. I know it's a day off for you, and I appreciate you coming in. It's been a fascinating conversation for me to be part of. And thank you everyone that's posted questions. I know we didn't get to all of the questions that were there. I do apologize for that, but time limits means we want to move on to the next sessions. A couple of other quick thank yous. Thank you to SDHistCon, who is an organization to build a diverse and supportive historical gaming community, for all their efforts in putting this conference together, for Sebastian Bay for his help in organizing this particular event. And then again, everybody in the audience for joining in and for your comments and questions. It's been fun, great fun for me to be a part of. And Annette, Nick, and Andrew, thank you so much for this.
Thank you for having us. It's been great to talk.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.